One of the new perspectives that we're hearing in the world is that there's a new world order. It is changing. It's a multipolar rather than one or two kind of big guns out there.
You know, Leon, when I started my career in 1984, it was already a changing world. Things keep changing, powers change, so we're always moving towards some sort of multipolar status. For a long time, of course, the US was primus inter pares, but I think that the ground is shifting maybe a little bit quicker than we're used to, and that's why it feels that there's a lot of change.
So we're feeling the change because it's quicker, not so much that it's changing.
The change is always happening.
Okay, got it. And one personal question I just wanted to hear from you, that have you ever defended positions during your professional career that you disagreed with?
Yes.
That's all I'm allowed to say, right? So, okay. Last question before we go into the real meat of today. Most important question that everybody really wants to know, especially music aficionados, is do you prefer Taylor Swift or Bruno Mars?
They're both kind of fun, but I would give Taylor Swift slightly higher marks.
Okay.
Given that she had such a magnificent series of performances here in Singapore, I think that helped as well.
Okay, but that actually, the Taylor Swift situation actually was, from a diplomatic perspective, had a couple of tensions that grew from it, right? And in that situation, you know, we had some other global country leaders say quite nasty things or suggested that we were playing unfair, right? How should we be handling that kind of conversations?
Well, some of our neighbors were a little bit unhappy that she was exclusively in Singapore and didn't go to other places in the region. You could do a number of things. You could fight back as these comments come out, that Singapore is being unfair. Or you could do sometimes the more sensible diplomatic thing, is just be quiet. You don't always have to respond. When someone throws a barb at you, you listen, as Colin Powell said, and then you don't have to respond because you know your position. No matter how you argue, you will never get the sort of both sides to compromise. You know, you mentioned my time in Washington, D.C. as ambassador to the United States. I also spent very much time in Indonesia and Malaysia. And with our neighbors, it's a little bit more testy sometimes, a little bit more contentious, but you want to build for the future. And that's a very important part of diplomacy as you look at it. It's not just fighting for a position, it is really taking a longer time to look at a relationship.
But is this the time that we have to be worried, be more cautious, or is this a time where you actually see all this uncertainty brewing optimism or potential and opportunity?
I think you have to be clear about your interests. That's the very important part. Every young diplomat joining our foreign service starts understanding the interests. I did that when I joined the diplomatic service. And then you sort of expand these interests, you understand the interests, you shift them a little bit because conditions change, but you take a very long-term view of these things. And yes, it may look a little bit more contentious around the world. We're in a confluence of great power rivalry, but your interests are the most important thing that drive you. They give you a value system that helps you to understand how you want to react to everything. And as I said, sometimes you don't have to react to certain things, but it gives you that groundedness of how Singapore should operate in a diplomatic world.
So talking about Singapore, I think there were many times where people said that Singapore was quite neutral on a lot of positionings. We didn't want to side one big power or the other. But would you say that is true right now when Singapore recently took a stance on Russia, for example, right? Where we actually now are blocking or actually putting sanctions on certain Russian transactions. So does that mean we're no longer neutral?
I disagree with the people who suggest that Singapore is neutral. Singapore is never neutral. We're always focused on our interests. And these interests get you to then decide how you want to deal with things. Neutrality means staying out of conflict. Switzerland, Costa Rica, these are neutral countries. You avoid the conflict around you. For a small country like Singapore, the little red dot, the conflict is all around us. You cannot avoid it. You cannot say, go away, I'll stick my head in the sand, and maybe then I'll be neutral. You then decide on interests. On the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the interest was defending international law. That is why Singapore took such a tough stance. It's not because one country or another country asked Singapore to take that tough stance. It is international law, and that's an interest as well. You don't have your interest just on aligning with countries, you have your interest in these principles of international law. And that really came across quite importantly of why we took a position, such a strong position, on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And particularly as a small country, you need to have the protection of international law, because without that, where's the space for small countries to operate in this difficult global environment?
So small countries, we keep referring to that. Do we have to play diplomacy different as a small country versus a lot of our neighbors who can be a little bit more forceful, a little bit more, poking the bear kind of behavior?
Being a small country, you do your diplomacy, but in a way you're much more nimble. And I think that's an advantage. When I started my term in Washington, D.C. in 2012, I came from a small country. There were lots of big countries over there, lots of ambassadors of big countries, Germany, France, the UK, China, India, they're all big countries. Where's the space for a small country to be able to get time with the White House? Because there are 200 countries represented in Washington, D.C. Every ambassador needs to get their agenda across. And Singapore, being a sort of uncontentious sort of country in the world, a close partner of the United States, sometimes there's a sense of complacency by our American friends. But the sense of nimbleness, offering ideas, being able to then suggest to the United States, to Washington, that Singapore can offer and play a role, that gets you through the door. It's not because a certain country in the region may be bigger, it's really that nimbleness, the ideas, the intellectual depth that you bring into these conversations. And very quickly on, Singapore had a space in the door. I mean, my predecessors did a lot of work. I carried on that work. And in 2016, many large countries had been invited by the Obama administration to come in for state visits. There was only one small country invited. That was Singapore. Then Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong was invited to do a state visit to Washington, D.C. And very unusual for a small country to have that status and honor. So you have to be nimble, you have to have the ideas, you have to be clear about your interests, and that's how diplomacy works.
So let me push you a little bit, because we hear always that Singapore has a privileged small country position for, say, the US. But what is it that we brought to the table that really made us give us that invite, right, to the White House or for them to come over? Could you give us a few perspectives on that?
Well, as I said, it's really offering ideas for a country like the US, or, similarly with a country like China as well, or India, offering ideas of how they can engage with not just us, but the region. For Singapore, the platform of ASEAN is very, very important. So all our diplomats are very focused on working on an ASEAN platform as well. And many of the larger countries are not quite sure how to deal with a grouping like ASEAN. They look at it, is it successful, is it unsuccessful? Singapore helps to position ASEAN for them in a way. Because take a country again like the United States. For many years, their foreign policy was based on what they call hub and spoke. They're a hub and all these spokes come out. How do you then say, actually, there's a grouping of countries that you can work with in a multilateral format? And again, it's Singapore that can offer some of these ideas, working with our partners. It's not something that we do alone, but working with our ASEAN partners to get that attention in Washington, D.C. or any other major global capital.
Makes sense. So bringing it back closer to ASEAN, has it been easier working in a far cry kind of country like the US versus, say, Indonesia or Malaysia, but the tensions are a lot deeper, it's a lot closer, and we have a lot more to potentially juggle at times with your time in Indonesia or even Malaysia? What was that like?
It's like a family. Sometimes you have quarrels. You have more quarrels with your immediate family, and someone who's further away, you don't have those quarrels. I spent 13 years in Indonesia and had that opportunity to learn the language, learn the culture, travel across the archipelago, go to many, many provinces. I think I've been to every province. And I spent a number of years in Malaysia as well. I think what's important in the role of diplomacy, and particularly with our neighbors, is understanding the historical context of the relationship. When I went to Malaysia, we may have been 30 years independent, maybe 35 years independent, many people still remembered the history of Singapore and Malaysia being one country. They remembered the history of separation. So the work of the diplomat cannot be divorced from that world of separation. Today it's much longer, it's 60 years, and there's a much more distance between those people who lived through separation and where we are today. But at the time that I was there, Dr. Mahathir was still the Prime Minister, the world of separation was still there, and there was a certain amount of regret on both sides that maybe we should not have been separate countries. If you understand this historical context, make the effort to understand it, but then offer a longer-term vision. What comes next? Yes, we are separate, but there are many things that we can do together. And you see that in the relationship that Singapore now has with Malaysia. People crossing the border. This is the busiest border crossing in the world between Singapore and Malaysia. And it's almost seamless. I mean, little issues sometimes come up, but this is a seamless...
Causeway Jam or the...
The Causeway Jam, and sometimes it's slower, but every day, hundreds of thousands of people cross both ways. You don't even realize it. They come, we go there, and it's such an easy relationship that you take a long-term vision, but you cannot then put away the historical context of that. I mean, I dealt with issues like the boundary between the two countries, dealt with issues like Pedra Branca, dealt with the issues like the railway land. Each one of these issues had a long history because we were meant to be one country. And when you get through that, so it becomes a slightly more complicated relationship. It's not just parachuting there and things are fine. I was High Commissioner to Australia as my first ambassadorial assignment. That was easy. You just parachute into Canberra, a nice quiet place, our interests align, you get things done. The historical context becomes less interesting, maybe a little bit during the Second World War that we worked together, but you don't really have to know the depths of these historical relationships. And I think that's really one of the things about diplomacy, taking that long-term view and understanding, but understanding the history as well behind that.
So I was wondering about this. You may give me the diplomatic answer. So is it easier working in the US versus Indonesia or Malaysia? Or?
In most of the countries I worked with different administrations. Dr. Mahathir stepped down and Abdullah Badawi took over as Prime Minister. When I was in Indonesia, I was there when Suharto was president. I was there when Habibie became president. I was there when SBY became president. In Washington, D.C., I was there when Obama was president, Trump was president, Biden was president. In Australia, John Howard was through my term over there. But every time there's a change, you make an adjustment. And you cannot, it's not really one is harder than the next. As I said, Washington is a hard place because you really need to get attention. You need to keep banging the door down to say, hey, pay attention to me, I'm a small country. In Malaysia and Singapore, they give us too much attention. Sometimes you don't want to have all that attention. Every day there may have been an issue to deal with, water price or something like that. Sometimes you don't need that much attention as well. But you manage between the two.
So how has time really helped us with our partners like Indonesia and Malaysia? I remember growing up in a time where there'd be accusations about Singapore and what we were doing that could potentially damage another country. Today we hear less of it. What has time actually taught you when working with our partners and these countries? And has time played a huge part in the diplomacy, right, with our neighbors?
I think with both countries, the formation of Singapore was very contentious. We had confrontasi with Indonesia when Malaysia was formed and Singapore after that. With Malaysia, obviously, the challenge of separation was very, very traumatic for people. And those memories carried through for at least half a generation, if not more. Because people still saw each other as competitive, as, they saw the world in zero-sum terms. You want to build a world in diplomacy where it's more than zero-sum terms. The word term people use is win-win. I would go even beyond that. You get outside the zero-sum world, but understand each other's interests, understand that actually as very close neighbors, you are complementary. Singapore will not have any other neighbors except Indonesia and Malaysia, and we have to learn to work with them. They have to understand us, we have to understand them. And the role of a diplomat, we have the world of diplomacy has changed a little bit with instant news, social media, WhatsApps, but the diplomat who goes in there, spends many years in the country, knows people, gets them to trust him or her, gets them to work with him, get them to share certain of their own perspectives. I think that's really the unique thing of diplomacy. It's not just coming there and saying, I'm going to solve all the problems. You have to understand the background of these things. So which is why Singapore diplomats, particularly the ambassadors, do spend extended periods in the countries they are assigned to. So you know people over an extended amount of time. People I knew when I first went to Indonesia in the 1980s ended up becoming president, foreign minister, and in key positions. But because we've known each other over 30 years, there's a certain amount of trust, and you can get along with them. They have different interests, we have different interests. How can some of these interests align? I think that's really the trick.
That's great. Ashok, again, thank you so much. You've been a great diplomat to us in Singapore, from what I'm told, and it's great, except the diplomatic answer, but we'll bypass that one. But everyone, please say thank you to Ambassador Ashok.
Thank you, Leon. I enjoyed this.
What a pleasure.
Thank you
so much.